what happens when you take that most famous of yellow munchers and blend it with the most frenetic of multiplayer matches, Bomberman? You get Rodman, the new release developed by Misfit and published by The Future Was 8-Bit. One thing which needs to be said is that seeing a new 8-bit game launch on 8 distinct platforms is certainly a jaw-dropping experience. And that means for a heck of a lot of retro dot-grabbing action. The goal is easy. Take control of Rodman and collect all the dots in each of the 3 levels. Things are complicated that little bit more, as each level is made up of 3 distinct screens featuring the garden on top, house in the middle, with the basement at the bottom. These are all linked by doors located at the top and bottom of each screen, allowing Rodman to freely move between them at will. A pair of doors is also located on the left and right sides of each screen, and when entered, Rodman is whisked over to the opposing side of the screen. Very handy for a quick getaway when those roaming critters get a little too close for comfort. Arcade-style maze games aren't arcade-style maze games without said wandering critters, and that is really where things get tough. Rodman has 5 of them to evade, and on most of the versions, these are colour-coded, allowing you to work out which is which. This becomes crucial, as with far simpler AI, there are 2 big factors which make them quite a challenge to avoid. First is their movement speeds. These range from a slow wander to breakneck pace. The way they're distributed offers no room for this to ramp up, as right from the very first screen, the fastest one is lurking in wait, ready to crush you in the blink of an eye. So you need to be on your guard pretty much the whole time while you're playing. The second reason is what is probably my biggest pain point, the collision detection. It kind of stems from how you move about the maze, one character square at a time. As you move, the collision routines make you vulnerable in both the space where you were and the space you're moving into. This particular behaviour I encountered over and over and over and over again as I was playing. In fact, it was at its most painful when dealing with moving around corners, because right when you think you've pulled off a very nifty getaway, it turns out you actually didn't, losing one of your lives in the process. These 2 factors edge the game from being a tough challenge into being kind of unfair. The lack of ramp up in the enemy speeds means you need to be on your toes from the start, and the collision detection means that accidentally getting in the vicinity of an enemy is likely going to end up badly for you. You have one means of defending yourself, however, collecting the yellow diamonds, which serve as bombs. Once dropped, they'll tick down over a few seconds before exploding out in the 4 cardinal directions, with each part of the blast stopping once it hits a wall. Now, for any critter which is trapped in that blast, they're wiped out, well, at least until you exit and re-enter the screen, which, for what it's worth, isn't too much of a problem. At least as I play things, I like to try and tackle each screen in sequence as I clear the stage. The bombs have one big drawback, however. Rodman is just as vulnerable to them as the critters are, so if you mess up your position and don't get out of the way in time, you're going to get caught up in the blast, and that's another of your lives gone. Each screen has 3 of them to collect, and Rodman can only carry 3 at a time, so you really need to learn how to use them as best as possible, for the sake of maximum efficiency. I really love them as a twist on the Energizer concept. Being able to tactically choose when to use them is a great way to limit feeling overpowered. And the fact you can get caught in the blast really means that it becomes a bit of a risk-reward scheme when it comes to using one, as you need to ensure that you can get out of the way before they go off and it all goes sour. In a way, this leads you to the control options. Of the 6 versions I'm looking at here, all support joysticks, typically via the built-in joystick ports. Alongside keyboard controls, Spectrum owners also have the option of Kempston or Sinclair's Interface 2 for joystick support, so if you're running an older machine or one of the newer Amstrad models, you're going to be sorted out just fine. Rodman will move a single square at a time based on your inputs, whether that's holding the joystick down continually or tapping it kind of frequently. Now, one thing to note is that on reaching a new square, if there's no input, Rodman will stop, so you will need to keep that in mind as you plan your way around each level. On a visual front, Rodman is designed around the character tile graphics capabilities used in many of the supported platforms. Of those which don't use that style of graphics, the Spectrum is the only one I'm featuring here, and honestly, whilst it may sound like a potential drawback compared to its peers, the Spectrum more than kept up in terms of how well it performs, along with having virtually no flicker in its animation. Rodman feels most at home on the VIC-20, where its lower resolution allows the action to take up the full screen, contrasting with the Atari, C64 and C16 versions, where the play area sits in the middle of the screen with a bunch of empty space taking up the rest. At least there's some nice background graphics, animated background graphics, to give the screen a little more activity on these machines. The Spectrum and MSX versions sit in the middle, whilst they've still got empty space. It's less distracting compared to the Atari, C64 and C16 versions. The animated background which those versions use is also present on the MSX, but unsurprisingly isn't part of the Spectrum version. Colours are chosen well, with unique colours selected for each enemy alongside differing background graphics for each room, plus the pickups and Rodman himself. Being able to determine which enemy is which becomes very handy when planning your runs throughout a stage, at least for knowing which enemy is going to be the bigger threat. The Atari hardware doesn't have this capability, so there's two versions of the game in the package. The first runs in the same high-resolution mode as the C64 and C16, but sadly only in monochrome. Whilst it's nice to have the option, this is one I feel really underserves the game here, simply because you can't tell which enemy is which. The version that is more commonly going to be played, however, is the multicolour version, and whilst this does introduce more colour alongside those chunky Atari pixels, it does bring one problem in. All the enemy critters use the same colour. While this is a bit of a step forward from the monochrome version, it's also still a bit of a step backwards from the other computer versions in that it removes the ability to distinguish those critters, adding to the game's challenge as a result. The sound is really the point where Rodman's cross-platform development is kind of stunting the final product. The audio is really designed around the limited capabilities of the VIC-20 sound hardware, so there's spot effects and a bit of a musical ditty which plays, but only when your character is moving, reminiscent of Dig Dug. Regardless of what machine you're playing on, these sound effects are pretty much going to sound the same, whether that's the VIC, the TED, the SID, Pokey, or AY chips. It's not a bad thing, but really don't expect any music to be pushing the hardware to the limits. An additional point of interest for Spectrum owners, well, at least those rocking 128K machines, is the full support for AY audio. Though I found as I was playing the game, I really had to bump up the volume on my TV in order to actually hear what was going on. So it's something you'll have to probably do as well. But thankfully, as it's AY only sound, you don't get the beeper blasting in your ears at the same time. Releasing a video game can be a challenge at the best of times, even when it's on one single platform. So to see Rodman launch on 8 of them at the same time is truly something that has to be celebrated. Right now, as I'm recording this, the only way to purchase it is via the special edition. This offers all 8 versions split across 3 different cassettes, It also includes all 8 versions as digital files for using on your emulator of choice or a preferred solid-state storage solution for real hardware. Owning 6 out of the 8 supported platforms really meant it was a good deal for me to pick the Special Edition up. And I'm sure that if you're in a similar position, you'll find it a great deal as well. For those who don't have such large collections of classic computers, I do hope other options will be made available, whether that's selling the digital downloads independently or the tapes outside of the Special Edition bundle. From my experiences playing Rodman on original hardware, I can't help but feel that the 3 Commodore versions are the ones I'm probably going to go back to the most often. From the VIC-20 version with its low resolution meaning a full screen game experience, to the C16 version where, well, I actually had the best runs. Funnily enough, due to that terrible joystick just happening to suit me more than anything. Those 3 versions and the C64 one are the most consistent and the most well put together out of the versions here. I was generally pretty happy with the Spectrum version. Its lower screen resolution resulted in less wasted space around the playfield, and the color choices very vibrant. My only real problem here is the excessively quiet AY audio. You know, maybe for you, if you've got a multi-machine setup, it's a bit silly to go back and crank the TV volume just for one game on one machine. The Atari version does look nice in its low resolution mode. The question, of course, being whether or not you appreciate the extra challenge from not being able to distinguish between those critters. In contrast though, its high resolution version loses a bit of that charm for me. They both have one oddity, however. If you're in the middle of enjoying a long enough session, the hardware screensaver will kick in. This basically flips the colors around to prevent screen burning. When it actually happened to be the first time while playing it, I was honestly, seriously freaked out. Thankfully though, just hitting a key every now and then is enough to keep it at bay. The MSX version was probably the one which was most tricky for me to get up and running, despite being one of the better versions of the pack. My initial experiences on my trusty MSX2 through my Mega Flash ROM cartridge resulted in a horrible cacophony of noise, and the experience was pretty much unplayable as a result. Now, admittedly, if I had a cassette cable around, I could probably have bypassed that and loaded it directly from my phone or something. But in the end, I simply dug out my original Spectra Video MSX1 machine, and whilst the video quality was more limited because it only handles composite, it loaded successfully there and was able to play and capture it. Rodman may offer just a simple arcade-style experience, but in the short term at least, it's one that you can certainly get plenty of thrills out of. The collision detection may be something which makes the long-term enjoyment less of a factor. I mean, for me at least, the fun for a game like this is to be able to come back to it every so often, try to beat your best score, and with the collision detection issues, this really compounded some frustration for me that kind of makes me not want to go back to it in the long term. Genuinely, had there been a little more tuning to Rodman and aspects of its gameplay, I genuinely think it would have been a sublime arcade experience and well worth your money. As it stands, it's fun, but potentially a little too frustrating for some to enjoy. And with that, I'm going to leave it here. Thank you all very much for watching.